Those of you who worked with me in the broadcast business over the years have heard me say many times, the eyes are the first thing to go. Not that long ago, growing old for many people meant progressive blindness. Cataracts was a phenomenon widespread, and today it's a remarkably simple procedure which has saved millions of people, I take it, from blindness. William Tsiaras, one of the great ophthalmologists in the world, is going to match Cameron's dissertation on teeth with a little dissertation on the eyes.
Now, Cameron showed you a couple of things about, hopefully, tumors that very few of us will get. But I'm going to talk to you about something today that everybody in this room is going to get, if you don't already have it. And virtually half, maybe a little over half of us are going to have an operation for this problem before we die.
According to the World Health Organization, 41 to 52 million people live with blindness or a visual impairment. Astonishingly, worldwide, approximately 80% of these cases are from diseases which are curable or preventable. Cataracts are the leading cause of blindness worldwide. Symptoms include fading of colors, blurred vision, and cloudiness, and if left untreated, total blindness.
This is an extraordinarily common problem. As we said, the leading cause of blindness in the industrialized world, 15 million people worldwide, 40 million by the year 2025. The lens is really a structure that's in the eye, it's behind the iris, and it's held together by these zonular structures. Interestingly enough, this structure has become, of late, over the last several years, extraordinarily interesting from a biological perspective and from a research perspective, because it turns out that the lens is probably going to give us much more information about what actually leads to apoptosis. And for those of you who don't know what apoptosis is, it's probably one of the hottest buzzwords in biology and medical science. It's sort of the process of programmed cell death. We all are programmed to die at a particular point. Some cells die earlier than others. But this structure is so fascinating because essentially, for the most part, these lens cells have no organelles for our entire body. Because normally when a nucleus of a cell is disrupted in any way, the cell dies. So now there's intense study of the lens protein and lens structure itself, because essentially the lens goes through a process of suspended animation for our entire lives. And that is probably going to be one of the most critical things we may learn about what actually leads to our own demise. The lens, along with the cornea in front of it, is literally responsible for focusing light. Without it, you take the lens out, you're hopelessly blurred. You're legally blind. You wouldn't be able to, you'd be seeing shapes and things, but you wouldn't be able to see very much. So roughly in our 4th decade of life, we develop presbyopia. And interestingly enough, presbyopia occurs in this hemisphere later than it does anywhere else in the world. It occurs somewhere around the ages between 45 and 47, on average. In other parts of the world, India, for example, it occurs in their late 30s. So, and again, this may have multifactorial. But, so we're all, for the most part, becoming very well accustomed with the fact that when you lose, that lens loses that ability, you can no longer accommodate. So, unlike other cells in the body, these cells don't regenerate. And so, over time and over stress, we start to see this process taking place. The structure, which is relatively clear, starts to become progressively more opaque. And in the process of becoming opaque, it becomes somewhat brunescent, yellow-brown in color. And this is important because it starts to affect lots of things. Claude Monet, for example, in his late 50s, started becoming very, very depressed and morose about the fact that he felt that he was losing sense of color. And this painting was done in his late 50s, I think. This Japanese footbridge at his home in Giverny, and very typical of his palette, the very soft greens, blues, purples, and things of that nature. He was diagnosed shortly thereafter with bilateral cataracts in his early 60s and was entirely resistant about having anything done. Of course, the surgery at that time was entirely different than the kind of surgery we do today. What you can see here is a classic effect of what happens with cataracts. Initially, what started happening is that color starts to be affected, okay? And I mentioned that the fact that the formation of the brunescent cataract, well, that spectrum will allow yellow, red, black to come through, but it'll eliminate all the softer tones. So what you see in his palette, this is later on in his life, What you see in the palette is the loss of the blues, the greens, the purples, and the introduction of brighter yellows, brighter reds, because those are the only colors he could see. The other thing that was most interesting here is also the loss of shape and form. So there's loss of color and there's loss of form. And actually, Monet went almost entirely and totally blind. And when he was about 80 or 81, he finally acquiesced and had cataract surgery. And it was a long and lengthy course, and I won't go into that process. But he finally recovered. They fitted him with one eye. He only had one eye done, and they fitted him with glasses. And he was absolutely horrified by what he had created in the last decade. He wanted to absolutely destroy all these canvases. The trouble was that many of them were hanging in some of the best institutions in France. This is a clear example of what happens. You lose color, you lose shape, and then you literally ultimately go blind. Surgery, unfortunately, today is the only treatment to correct this problem. The good news is that cataract extractions with lens implantations is perhaps the most successful procedure that we do in all of medicine. We use a keratome, and we actually enter the anterior chamber on an angle so that this wound actually self-seals at the end of the procedure. We don't use any sutures. We then actually insert a viscoelastic material to protect the endothelial surface of the cornea and to provide a nice surface for the next step that we need to do, and that is to use this little bit of a cystotome to make an opening on that anterior lens capsule. We actually peel a continuous circle on the surface of that lens, and you can see me now holding on to that piece, and you see how we sort of rip it all the way around? This has to be continuous. It can't break, because otherwise you can't proceed with the procedure. So you make that continuous circle, and then we use fluid to hydrodissect and to separate away the nucleus and cortex from the capsule. So this lens is sitting suspended by these zonules in this capsule. We hydrodissect it so that now the lens is freely movable. And then we use this ultrasonic device, which is using, which has fluid and ultrasound, and we literally start breaking up the nucleus, which is like a rock. So in order to break it out and remove it through this 2.5 millimeter incision, we sort of have to conquer and divide. We have to break it in half and then in quarters. So what we do is we scoop down over the surface of the lens, far enough down through the surface of the lens so that we can weaken it, and then we literally try to split it in half. And then do the same thing. We sort of rotate it, do the same process, and split it in 4 quarters, 4 quadrants. And once we've removed the cortical material, there's a little bit of a residual amount of cortex that's adherent to the capsule. And then we'll use another suctioning device to go in and to vacuum off all of those cortical fragments off the posterior portion of that capsule. You can see that capsule is extraordinarily flimsy. Then we implant this polymethyl methacrylate lens that has been predetermined to set for that person's eye. We use a device which literally folds this lens up outside the eye. It's all folded in this injector. We go in through this 2.5 millimeter incision, and then we inject this lens into the eye, and it unfolds inside the eye, and then we actually direct it into the capsular bag. Okay? We'll put the first haptic into the capsular bag. You can see that whole lens has been just injected now into the, and then we remove the injector. So this lens is sitting now in, half of it in the capsular bag, half of it out. We just dial it into position. Once it's dialed into position, we make sure that the incision is watertight, and for the most part, we're done. So the lens is in place, and we're done. And if that works well, you have a successful operation. I think the next major change is going to be this. And that is that, you know, the bane of our existence, especially now as the population is getting older, is presbyopia. I mean, people are just affected by this in a dramatic way. And what we now are able to do is to implant these lenses which have multifocal capabilities. It turns out in the States that we're probably implanting somewhere around 10 to 15% of all the patients with these kinds of lenses. It's not entirely perfected yet. There are 3 different kinds of lenses which have been designed. All have 3 specifically different kinds of design in terms of what they do. But they are now able, in some patients, to allow them to be able to focus distance and near without spectacles. So I think this is going to be dramatic once we really, literally get this perfected. That's the most exciting thing, I think, on the horizon. Finally, you know, I think that prevention makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, you know, if you go online to look at what may prevent these things, there's a plethora of stuff out there that claims that it'll prevent cataracts. Nothing prevents cataracts, at least that we know of at this particular point in time. Not herbs, not antioxidants, nothing. So I wish I could leave you with something that says, you know, if you did this, you won't get this. But unfortunately, there isn't anything that I can offer you with that. But I do think that there's great hope for the future, and I hope that this was instructive. Thank you.
Thank you, William.